Serious people who have come out of comas. What was the most jarring thing you learned to have happened while in a coma? After I had fallen off a scaffold that was 40 feet high, I had a major concussion. I was in a coma for almost 9 years, and when I woke up, it felt like I was out for longer than a night's worth of sleep, but I thought that maybe I was out for a few days. My head was pounding, I was really dizzy and my throat was so dry. I reached up and felt my head, and when there was no bandages or wounds, I got so confused. Apparently I started screaming frantically for the nurse. When the nurses got into the room, I demanded to be taken home. And that's when I found out I was paralyzed from the waist down. Also my mother, my last remaining relative, died a couple of years before I woke up. I had been basically ward of the state, and the hospice place I was put in wasn't taking care of me very well. I had huge wounds on my back and heels, and I was so frail and thin, I looked like a human skeleton. I was very weak and helpless. My boss had felt bad and left me money in his will. Yup, he died too, about 3 weeks before I woke up. While I was out, several things in the outside world had happened. The tragedy that was 9/11 happened. Then we caught Saddam, and he was executed. And the iPhone was invented. Another shocker was that we had a black president. I was in a coma for about 2 weeks and my short-term memory wasn't working. When I came out of it, they would give me 3 coins, and I couldn't add them up because I couldn't store the intermediate result. When it sorta kinda started working, I would notice the state of the room. It would change, and I wouldn't remember the change. That means life was dreamlike. Stuff happened that didn't make sense. Plus, my last memory was at college, independent and living on my own. After my coma, I was in the hospital, surrounded by nurses helping me out, a complete environment change. My big day. The day I got a day pass out of the hospital and went to me university. That was when I went, oh shit, it's not a dream. I will never forget the moment where I thought that. My uncle was piloting a single engine plane, crashed, broke many bones, screws, plates, casts, etc. Was in a short coma. Woke up not remembering anyone or any history. Had to be trained to walk, eat, tie his shoes. Years of rehab. Was an appliance repairman before the crash. Could fix anything. He retained only 2 things. His ability to repair anything and his sarcasm. He's now 81 years old. Still a prick. 6 years ago my dad was in a coma after collapsing and having a huge list of things go wrong. Anyway, he's in a coma for 9 months with 3% chance of survival. The hospital had called us to say that we should come and say goodbye as they were going to turn the ventilator and life support off. 5 days after saying goodbye we get a call saying that he was breathing on his own and responding to medication. The drugs he had been given during his coma had made him deaf, so he had to deal with that. One night he called my mum at about 3 AM asking for his motorbike, his leathers and helmet, a toolbox, his iPad, a torch, some rope and his glasses. He told my mum that he was going to break out by climbing down the window and riding home. The nurses heard him shouting to my mum and managed to calm him down, but looking back on it, it seems quite funny. 6 months later, and he was home. I came home from school one day and he was in the kitchen. I went in to say hi and tell him I was home, and he started pointing a knife at me and telling me to get out of his house. He didn't know who I was and couldn't understand why I was in his kitchen. I called my mum and she came home and sorted it all out. It's been 6 years since, and he's one of the most horrible people I know and a nasty alcoholic. I was in a coma for a week from an intentional drug overdose at 14. When I woke up I found out not only had teachers taken it upon themselves to tell all the students at school that I had attempted suicide, but made all of them sign a card for me. It was really kind of weird to read messages of get well soon from the same girls that had bullied me relentlessly, rumors, fights, spitting on me, messages on lockers and on bathroom walls, instant messages, notes, to the point I felt like death was the only escape. When I first awoke, though, I had puked up the charcoal still sitting in my stomach onto my lap. It was a thick black vomit. Then I looked up and saw only the white wall of the hospital. I thought I was dead and had arrived in hell. I was slightly relieved to see I wasn't, but that card pissed me off. Although some people really meant their messages, making everyone in my class sign made it a kick in the gut. The same girls then bullied me and called me a psycho that couldn't even die right for cutting and attempting suicide when I returned to school. Not sure what you mean by come out of coma, but I have two situations which should answer your question. First, backstory. On July 30th, 1990, my family was involved in a severe car accident. I suffered a depressed skull fracture resulting in an emergency craniotomy and removal of obviously necrotic brain tissue, of which amounted to roughly 1/3 of my total brain mass. As a precaution, I was placed in a medically induced coma which lasted for 6 days. Mind you, I was 5 years old. While in ICU directly following surgery, I vividly remember hearing my mother singing a lullaby. Due to other injuries I suffered, they had my eyes taped shut. I remember trying to open my eyes to see my mom's face. I was startled when I couldn't. I started to cry because I was scared and had no idea what was happening, and hearing her voice gave me great joy. Remember, this is entirely auditory. I remember hearing a strong male voice tell my mother to stop singing and to leave because it was upsetting me. Hearing her beg to stay by my side was the most painful experience of my life. As a child, death was unbeknownst to me. Also, as an innocent child, I never imagined my parents could lie to me. When I came out of my coma, I had lots of physical therapy and lots of time on my hands. I began to ask questions. First of all, I wanted to know about my dog Sheba. She and I were inseparable, and she was in the car with us. So I asked my father where she was. Important. My parents had only recently divorced, and my father was already remarried. He told me that Sheba was fine and with my grandfather, who was taking care of her. I was thrilled to hear this and went on with it for several weeks. Then late one evening, the doctors allowed my mother to take me outside for the first time. She took me to a very nice part of the patio and broke the news that while all three of us, my mother, brother, and I, survived, Sheba wasn't so lucky. This was the first time I had ever confronted death, and it was the first time I had ever realized my own mortality and how close I came to dying. It still makes me cry when I think back on this. I consider it the day I lost my innocence. Sadly, I have more stories, like finding out that my father tried to block my 8-hour life-saving surgery because he wanted a second opinion while I had brain matter leaking from my ear. I had a friend who was in a partial coma, not sure of the technical name for his condition, but he was moderately responsive, but obviously out of it and not really in touch with reality. Kinda like someone asleep, he would sort of respond to external stimuli, but it wasn't as if he was aware of what was going on. Anyways, he was a heavy pot smoker, and his father didn't know. Well, while he was in the hospital, he kept doing phantom bong rips in the hospital bed, with his dad present. At first, his dad had no idea what was going on, but once he figured out what the motions meant, he was pretty pissed. Kid woke up having to explain a few things. Before I met my husband, he'd had an accident, undetermined, in hotel swimming pool. He was in a coma for 3 weeks or so. When he woke up, he had no memory of the accident or being at the hotel, and his body was still swollen from the near drowning experience. His family says he was so waterlogged he looked like Eddie Murphy and the Nutty Professor. The only thing he remembers from his coma are nightmares, which he says are the scariest he's ever had and defy explanation. He has a minor seizure disorder as a result, and a bit of short-term memory loss. The hardest things for him after coming to were learning to walk again. It took weeks and was extremely painful. Trying to pee, also painful, but mostly just impossible. And finding out that his dad had sold the car he'd been fixing up for 2 years because his dad is an asshole in general. It was unrelated to the accident. It wasn't really a coma, but I was out for nearly a day. I got sideswiped while go-karting and slammed into a wall at 90 km/h. I knew I was knocked out unconscious, but was still aware, and literally in this timeless dream state for what seemed like eternity. I was trapped half inside my body and half outside. Everything was so vivid and colorful. I was seeing everything as vibrating energy, which is literally what matter is. Slowed down light vibrating at different frequencies. Everything relating to humans just felt so fantasy and trivial. I could hear noises through my ears, but it was like I was not there. I was just a part of everything. Humans looked alien to me, but also familiar. It was like a dream, so it is hard to recall and explain as it happened, but it made me realize that time doesn't actually exist, and separation is an illusion. Everything is interconnected. I'm not religious, but I'm very open to Eastern teachings such as Buddhism, because it explains reality in a way I can relate to. I knew a guy who was in a coma for about 2 months. It was more of a medicated thing, I guess. I think he's like 70 to 75 or so. And, of course being old, shit happens. And he felt really sick one day, so they brought him to the hospital. One thing led to another, they knocked him out, and kept him out for 2 months. And throughout that whole time, his entire body was just shutting down and nothing was working right. Everybody thought he was going to die. But, they figured out what was wrong with him, patched him up, and sent him on his way. But the thing he said that bothered him the most about it was that one day it was April, and the next day it was June. He woke up one day, and 2 months of his life were just gone. So I guess he didn't really learn anything like some of the other people here. Nobody died, there wasn't a huge disaster or anything. He just learned that he lost 2 months of his life, and that was jarring enough, I guess. My story is close to the subject matter. My sister had a massive heart attack at 39. They lost her in the ambulance and had to use the paddles. She responded. However, in the air they lost her again. This time she was given chest compressions. Ended up having a bypass. She's fine. But months later, I asked her what it was like getting CPR. She said that all she remembers is wanting this big guy to stop pushing on her chest. She said she was helpless to do anything but was aware what he was doing. My dad was put into an induced coma, I think. I'm not sure whether it was induced or not. A few months ago upon falling from a pretty big ladder. He's with it now for the most part, but when he just recently came from the coma at the hospital, he couldn't remember me being his 17-year-old son or my older sister, but he could remember my 3 other siblings. As he came to, he couldn't be swayed and thought that I was a lot younger than I am and couldn't shake the fact that I'm 17 for a while. He also forgot my name and was pretty violent to nurses and the like. He's fine now, except from a couple little details, but he's fully functional and remembers everything. He spent 2 months in hospital for the injury. I worked in an army hospital in Germany in the 1970s. During a field exercise, a convoy of jeeps and Gamma Goat, all-terrain vehicles, went through a barrier in fog and ended up going down the side of a mountain. 5 vehicles pancaked each other. The lead driver was the worst off, head injury, in a coma 3 days. Lots of other banged up troops went to the hospital too. Driver came out of a coma, saw his buddies and freaked out. He was so sure they'd died, he swore he'd seen it happen. So he was certain he had died too, and was paying for his sins in hell. I was in a coma for nearly 2 months. When I came to, I didn't know how to read or write, had difficulty talking, had to learn how to eat and drink again, as well as gain strength back to even sit in a chair. It took me a few months to go from being able to sit up to actually walking without a walker. I lack about a year or more worth of memories from my early 20s. I also suffer from mild PTSD due to memories my brain created while in the coma of events in my life that never happened that were horribly traumatic. I have horrible nightmares due to those memories still. I also dreamt of events I saw happen over the next few years after coming out of the coma. I don't know if all of that is common, just my little experience. My dad's tale. Last November, my dad was sick with what he thought was a cold. He went to an after-hours clinic, and they did a chest x-ray and spotted something on his lung. Told him he needed to schedule an appointment with an oncologist. It wasn't a cold, but he would be fine until then. 2 days later I go to check on him, and find him pretty much passed out on his couch, barely conscious. Call a nurse friend and my brother. It appears almost like an overdose to me. The other 2 agree. We check his meds and notice he has some narcotics prescribed for back pain. Turns out he was so sick he took the medicine, fell asleep, woke up and forgot he took it, and took it again. He was essentially odding on opiates. At the hospital they get him out of the overdose, but his lungs are barely functioning, and he is showing signs he may have had a heart attack. Eventually they decide to induce a coma and airlift him to the nearest VA hospital. The VA initially tells us he probably has cancer and his lungs are full of fluid, but it was an infection that turned into pneumonia. He aspirated some of his stomach acid, bad reflux, and it burned ulcers inside his lungs which then turned into abscesses/cysts. These made it easy for him to contract pneumonia. The doctors managed to kill that with tubes in his lungs and lots of antibiotics and antivirals. He remains in a coma for 2 weeks while they try to save him, all the while telling us he isn't going to make it. Then one morning he wakes up, pulls the tube from his throat, and sits bolt upright in the bed. He fights the nurses until they can get him restrained. From that moment on he was awake, but had no idea where he was. He didn't know who my brother and I were, nor did he know what year it was. He thought he was in a hospital in Sagan in 1969. He thought my brother was one of his army buddies. He wanted to know when he could go home and see his baby girl, my eldest sister, and his first wife, the one who divorced him in 1971. Then he forgot that much and thought he was in Ohio. We live in Washington. As a teenager. Then, like someone turning on a light, one day he woke up and remembered nearly everything. The next day they released him, just like that. He told us the 2 weeks or so after the coma was the most terrifying time of his life, and he did 2 tours in Vietnam, one working on the border of Laos. Everything was like a dream. He'd close his eyes for a second, open them back up, and not know where he was, or how he got there, or who the people were in the room with him. He forgot who he was, he forgot how to pee. Seriously, he couldn't remember how to hold his dick and aim it at a toilet. He got to the bathroom and started crying. He also said, after that experience, that if he gets diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, he wants to be allowed to commit suicide.